that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, and a terrorist.
President Barack Obama announcing to the world that U.S. soldiers had found and killed the most wanted man on the planet. 5 years on, what impact has the legacy of Osama bin Laden had on American policymakers and on how the West deals with the Muslim world? And has the so-called war on terror made us all any safer? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fawzia Ibrahim. It was an emotional moment for many Americans. The man who orchestrated the killing of more than 3,000 people on September 11, 2001 and evaded capture for years was dead. But 5 years after his controversial killing, Osama bin Laden's message lives on, inspiring a new generation of armed groups around the world, many of them more violent than al-Qaeda. For Muslims, bin Laden was the face of a global militancy that hijacked their religion, as well as the man who triggered the so-called war on terror, a campaign which has come to define American foreign policy post 9/11 and which continues to shape the relationship of many countries with the Muslim world. Let's get straight into the discussion now and bring in our guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C., David Gartenstein-Ross, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. In Birmingham, Afshin Shahi, Director of the Center for the Study of Political Islam, and in Beirut, Ahmad Musali, Professor of Political Science at the American University of Beirut. Welcome, gentlemen, to all of you. Now, we hear a lot about the impact that the war on terror has had on Western nations. We hardly ever hear about the impact on Muslim nations as well. Mr. Musali, if I could start with you, I want to talk about the individual level. Many Muslims have complained that because of the war on terror, they have felt discriminated, ostracized, and have had to justify their presence and their religion in the wider community. What's been the fallout of this?
Well, definitely, I think the war on terrorism has gone astray, and it has not targeted the players that should have been targeted from the very beginning. It turned out now into, as we are seeing it, a conflict that is taking some civilizational dimensions, as well as going back to the old game, the West against the rest. And I think a lot of Muslim individuals, as well as countries and groups, feel that they are discriminated against, especially after the invasion of Iraq and the fallout that came out from that. And what we are seeing today, the rise of the level of violence and the creation of Daesh and the creation of an Islamic State in Syria and Iraq is a direct repercussion of the war on terrorism that is not really working at all. On the contrary, I think we can explain later if you want, it has increased the level of terrorism, violence, and the level of destroying the quote-unquote nation state in the Arab world, and we will see more beyond in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other countries as well.
We definitely will touch on that issue. We will come back to that. Mr. Shahi, though, a lot of people have said that the war on terror has actually brought about a clash of civilizations, shall we say. How has the Muslim world, Muslim governments, Muslim nations, and indeed individual Muslims reacted to the linkage of their religion to violent acts that we've seen in the media?
Yes, I mean, without any doubt, some people have portrayed the so-called war against terror as a war between different civilizations and different belief systems and different value systems. But we need to be very clear, from the very beginning of the so-called war against terror, there was a lot of confusion about this term, terror. what do you mean exactly? Who is the enemy here? The war against terror. Terrorism is not an enemy. Terrorism is a tactic that some sub-state actors like al-Qaeda or the Islamic State use in order to basically utilize the politics of fear in order to gain concession. So from the very beginning, the very term kind of war on terror was a false metaphor which basically paved the way to a lot of abuse and paved the way to a lot of misuse of security policies which were implemented certainly within the West, which certainly undermined human rights. And beyond the West, the idea and the practices and the policies which were connected to war on terror certainly widened the division between the West and the East, and it created these extremely simplistic binaries of us versus them, black versus white, civilized versus uncivilized. And unfortunately, these kind of simplistic binaries of us versus them are being abused and used by some other organizations like the Islamic State, and they are using these terms, using these binaries, using these discourses in order to recruit more and more people and using exactly the same ideas to their benefit.
Well, that being the case, I want to take up this interesting issue that the war on terror has been used, or the policies that are linked to the war on terror have been used and abused, particularly for the benefit of certain individuals or groups. Mr. Gartenstein-Ross, if you could come into the discussion here and explain to us, how do you see these policies that are linked to the war on terror? How has that been used by certain governments, perhaps, to benefit their own interests?
That certainly has been the case. I mean, I think the last guest in pointing to simplistic binaries is point to something which I think has characterized this discussion so far, in that you've been taking all of the post-9/11 policies and putting them under a single umbrella, that of a U.S.-led global war on terror. Many policies can be attributed to that, some of which were quite bad, some of which were fairly beneficial in terms of preventing future attacks. But this is a problem that numerous governments have had to deal with. I just got back from Nigeria. The problem of Boko Haram is one which they would have to deal with regardless of the war on terror. Likewise, in a number of Middle Eastern states, the policies that you're facing are a little bit delinked from that. So let's take one of the things which I think has been most harmful that has led to a lot of the jihadist violence of the past 5 years, and that is the NATO invasion of Libya. That wasn't actually at all a war on terror policy, and I think that, in fact, had the U.S. and NATO and the Arab League been more attuned to the dangers of jihadists exploiting the kind of gap that this left in Libya, they would have been more hesitant to go in. The reason why that was undertaken had nothing to do with terrorism, but rather the reason they went into Libya was to stop Gaddafi from slaughtering people in Benghazi, and there was quite a bit of mission creep that occurred thereafter, where they actually wanted to topple Gaddafi. Now, to be very clear, that then left a major gap in the area where the Libyan military was destroyed. It never got reconstituted. You had Tuareg mercenaries who'd fought for Gaddafi, who went into northern Mali, destabilized it, leading to al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb's takeover. And today, the problem in Libya, including the Islamic State and al-Qaeda, fundamentally threatens the transition in Tunisia. Egypt has its own set of problems, but Libya also threatens it as well. So sometimes the policies have been related to the war on terror, and those have, I wrote a book back in 2011 that came out just after the 10th anniversary of 9/11, which critiqued our war on terror policies. But at the same time, we can't put everything under that blanket umbrella, and sometimes the problem, in fact, is not paying enough attention to the threat posed of sub-state groups, and thus blundering into places like Libya.
It's interesting that you say the war on terror has definitely spawned other terror groups, and definitely a feeling that terrorism has increased in the world as well. But let's go back to the issue of al-Qaeda, how it's changed and how it's actually spurned more terrorism, more fear in the world. So how has al-Qaeda changed since bin Laden's death in 2011? Well, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen, has become the group's most active affiliate, taking advantage of the chaos brought on there by the war. And al-Qaeda in the Sahel region of Africa has successfully recruited and trained hundreds of new fighters, particularly in Mali. But But in many ways, al-Qaeda has been overshadowed by the emergence of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Now, ISIL conquered and is governing large areas of territory in Iraq and Syria, setting up their vision of a caliphate al-Qaeda was patiently waiting to create. As a result, some al-Qaeda affiliates, such as Boko Haram in Nigeria, have shifted their allegiances to ISIL instead. Mr. Gartenstein-Ross, does this now make al-Qaeda irrelevant in the world, particularly in the face of far more violent groups like ISIL and Boko Haram?
Not in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that al-Qaeda poses the greater long-term threat than ISIL. A lot of the difference between the two groups goes back to al-Qaeda in Iraq's defeat back in the 2007 to 09 period. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, of course, later became ISIL. Now, when it got defeated, there were several reasons for this. And look, everybody agrees that it got defeated. Al-Qaeda views it as having been defeated. The U.S. did. And Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi had to basically rebuild the organization from scratch. And unfortunately, there were a lot of openings that he had for reasons related to Syria and related to the Iraqi political situation. But when al-Qaeda looked at that period, they looked in particular at the Sahwa, or the Awakening Movement, which was a grassroots uprising against al-Qaeda. And their view was that they lost the population. After 07 to 09, al-Qaeda sought to become more population-centric, to embed itself with populations, to work alongside local militant groups without dominating them, and to reduce its level of on-camera violence. Not to become an organization that doesn't use brutality, they certainly do, but to, in contrast to ISIL, keep that brutality off camera. Now, when you get to ISIL's split from al-Qaeda, when it was expelled from the al-Qaeda organization, al-Qaeda has continued its pivot while ISIL has become more and more violent. Al-Qaeda contrasts itself to ISIL, doing this very explicitly in its propaganda, saying, look, those are the real Kharijites. We're actually a moderate organization, portraying themselves as, quote-unquote, moderate jihadists. Furthermore, if you look at their approach in Syria, where Jabhat al-Nusra works beside a wide range of local militant groups, and in Yemen, where they've embedded themselves with the tribes, they've done a very good job of becoming population-centric. Now, you're right that Boko Haram did leave the al-Qaeda ambit. It was never officially recognized as an affiliate, but I certainly agree that it was part of al-Qaeda's orbit before it left for ISIL. I just got back from Nigeria. I got back on Saturday, and I can tell you for a fact that Boko Haram is experiencing buyer's remorse right now because al-Qaeda is much stronger than ISIL is in the Sahel region. And so rather than having a base of operations outside of Nigeria that's right next door in the Sahel, they have to go all the way up to Libya, which makes them a weaker organization, including the fact that al-Qaeda simply has more resources in Africa. So about a year ago, a lot of the talk was how al-Qaeda had become irrelevant. Today, I think it's very clear that it hasn't at all.
Mr. Shahi, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Would you agree that perhaps al-Qaeda, while perhaps remaining a little less prominent these days in the face of ISIL and Boko Haram and even the Taliban, would you say that they have far more staying power, so to speak, than these other groups?
I mean, ISIS, which in a way, as you know, kind of regenerated itself out of al-Qaeda, had a very, very effective, if I may use this term, marketing strategy to make itself kind of the most relevant and the most important and the most vicious terrorist organization in the region. And for that reason, certainly over the last couple of years, they've been able to get a lot of attention regionally and internationally. And obviously, the weaknesses of states both in Iraq and Syria helped the Islamic State to gain a lot of territory. But that doesn't, as the previous speaker said rightly, that doesn't mean al-Qaeda has lost its imminent. After all, the kind of ideas which were kind of championed by al-Qaeda for years and years are now being kind of adopted again by the Islamic State. Over the last 6 or 7 months, we know that the Islamic State is under retreat, is under a great deal of pressure. And now we see that even the so-called Islamic State are going back to the same policies, the old classic traditional policies of al-Qaeda. I call this al-Qaedaization of the Islamic State. We see that, they are increasingly resorting to the politics of fear, the kind of things that we have seen recently in Paris and Iraq, in order to gain concession, just exactly in the same way that al-Qaeda used to do from 2001 to 2011. So again, it would be extremely simplistic to assume that the very fact that they haven't been able to get a lot of attention in the same way that ISIS has been, they are irrelevant. And as you mentioned it yourself, over the last year, they proved that they still have a great deal of ability to work with local forces and local tribes to govern a great deal of area, a great chunk of area in Yemen. And at the same time, as they proved that in 2015, what happened with Charlie Hebdo atrocities, they still have the ability to orchestrate extremely problematic operations outside the Middle East and outside the region and in Europe.
Mr. Musali, the one thing that binds al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Boko Haram and ISIL is the need and aim to establish an Islamic caliphate. Is it time that we accept the fact that every drone, every bomb, every attack on a village does nothing to weaken this ideology?
Well, I think one has to look at this phenomena as the rise of Islamic jihadist Salafism. And within it, there are different formations. ISIS, I think, in the long run, will be proven to be only one formation of al-Qaeda. And I agree with your guest that al-Qaeda is there to stay and will stay regardless of the formation. If today we crush the Islamic State, I think we will see the integration of the different groups and people again into al-Qaeda. We are witnessing the collapse of the Arab system, or if you want, the system of state in the Middle East. And I think what helped in doing this is the destruction of Iraq. And I think it has a lot to do with Iraq. We cannot say it doesn't. And the example that your guest gave, Libya, is a marginal example, but also it shows that the destruction of the system that was supposed to be replaced by a new Middle East backfired, and instead we are seeing the rise of and formations of different al-Qaeda and Salafist jihadist group. Today the fight is not only with a military force. I think that will happen sometime in the future. But as we speak today, the ideology of jihadist Salafism is being spread all over the world, not only in the Arab or the Islamic world, but even beyond that. The danger is, I think, and the question at the same time is what to do and how to develop this area. It's not enough to say we have these groups, and I don't want to say, go back into East-West, because these groups are killing Muslims before others, are killing Sunnis before Shia, and so on and so forth. So it's not, a two-dimensional fight, although sometimes when it happens in the West, it takes the view that it is Islam against Western culture and civilization. It is not.
No, it's not. But let's focus on what the Muslim world has done for the war on terror, or how to battle the war on terror, shall we say. Mr. Shahi, how do you see the Muslim world, Muslim governments, how have they shaped their foreign and domestic policies in the light of this war on terror? And has it worked?
I think in a way, I think if you do look at what has been happening in the region over the last 5 years, the international relations of the Middle East, the foreign policy of important actors like Iran and Saudi Arabia, in a way have paved the way to further empowerment of these sub-state actors. Now we know that the main currency, the main ideological currency in the region is sectarianism. Various states like the Islamic Republic of Iran and Saudi Arabia have been using sectarian binaries, using sectarian perspectives in order to broaden their own interest and spheres of interest in the region. And of course, these ideas, these sectarian perspectives and these kind of sectarian policies had a lot of implications, important implications for sub-state actors. Now for organizations like the Islamic State, it's much easier to create these binaries of us versus them, black versus white, Sunni versus Shia, because in a way the international relations of the Middle East to a very large degree is conditioned by these sectarian perspectives. So in my opinion, most of the actors, most of the important actors in the region, in the Middle East and the wider Arab world, in a way not only they have helped to prevent and minimize Islamic radicalization, jihadi radicalization, but they even embraced it. Not necessarily embraced it because they wanted to endorse it, but their policies directly or indirectly paved the way to their further empowerment, and it helped certainly their recruitment and the way in which they legitimize themselves and rationalize themselves.
We've been looking at the wider picture on how the war on terror has affected domestic as well as foreign issues. Now, the global fight against armed groups like al-Qaeda is having far-reaching effects, as I mentioned, on foreign policy as well as geopolitics, but it's also affecting our own individual lives every day. There's been a rise in xenophobia around the world. Deportations from the US have doubled since 9/11, and European politicians have proposed laws against dual citizenships. Airport security has changed dramatically. There are now full-body scanners and new restrictions on what travelers can take on board aircraft. And governments around the world have expanded their domestic surveillance programs, giving them the power to tap phone calls as well as to read personal emails. David Gartenstein-Ross, has this been abused? Has these policies for national security, have they been abused?
This is going to be a debate that people have for a long time, because the problem set isn't going away. A problem set where small groups of individuals can do more damage than they ever have before, and where governments are trying to adapt, sometimes trying with their best efforts, sometimes not doing so, sometimes trying to give themselves more powers under the pretext of fighting terrorism. But this is just inherently a problem that's going to be there. You talk about airports and full body scanners. Of course, the reason why we now have full body scanners in airports is because of an innovation that came out of Yemen, where the chief bomb maker of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Asiri, was able to come up with an innovation called a crotch bomb. After that, authorities had to figure out a way to stop the crotch bomb, or else to leave that vulnerability in place. Thus, they got full body scanners. So often, this is a response to what violent non-state actors are doing. Another good example, of course, is what you mentioned, surveillance, where now with the explosion in encryption post-Edward Snowden, end-to-end encryption and the like, as well as the tradecraft that ISIL has been able to have, they have massive networks in Europe. You know, when you look at the Paris attack and then the Brussels attack, which came so close in proximity to each other, that's the first time that a single jihadist terrorist cell was able to carry out one attack, then have the weight of European security and intelligence brought down upon them, and carry out another major attack. Like 5 years ago, most terrorism analysts would have told you that a network of this magnitude in Europe would have been impossible. So this is a debate that we're going to be having for a long time, where those limits should lie.
Right. That being the case, here's my final question to you, Mr. Afshin Shahi. Is the world a safer place now that we have the war on terror and the policies that are linked to it?
Of course, it would be extremely simplistic and reductionist to reduce all the problems that we have right now, certainly in the Middle East and the wider Arab world, to the so-called war against terror. But at the same time, I think it is fair and valid to assert that the policies which were affiliated to the idea of war against terror has created a great deal of instability in the region. I can talk specifically about the Middle East. The Middle East is more unstable today. There are at least 3 failed states right now in the region, and these failed states are creating a lot of instability, a lot of chaos. And within this chaos, organizations like the Islamic State, like Daesh, are rising and creating a lot of problems, a lot of security impediments, not only for the countries within the Middle East, but certainly for the wider global context.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for contributing to the discussion. Thank you to all our guests, David Gartenstein-Ross, Afshin Shahi and Ahmed Musali. And thank you to you too for watching. You can watch the program again anytime by visiting our website. And for further discussion, you can always go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can always join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Fawzia Ibrahim, and the whole team, thanks for watching.